There is a deep hypocrisy when it comes to bringing people into the world. When we create someone, we accept on their behalf all of the suffering that's going to happen to them over the course of their lifetime. And we accept for them the risk that that could be an extraordinary amount of suffering if they're unlucky enough. And we do all of this without even being able to consult them. This is a standard we only seem to accept in the context of procreation just because it's the norm. It's the done thing. It's just accepted, but should it be? In this video, I want to reveal the shocking hypocrisy behind the decisions we make to create children. Now, before looking at the hypocrisy itself, we need to look at the double standard which underlies it. The double standard is in how we consider the implications of our actions for those who already exist and those who don't exist at the moment but will exist and suffer the same consequences nonetheless. See, there isn't a morally relevant difference between the consequences of our actions for someone who already exists and someone who will exist in the future and is still directly impacted by our actions in the same way. Let me give an example that was devised by Derek Parfit. Imagine you're walking through a field and you drop a glass bottle. That glass bottle obviously smashes, and now the shards of glass pose a hazard to anyone who would be walking through that field barefoot. You happen to know that children regularly play in this field, and it's likely that sooner or later one of them will walk across this glass and cut their foot if you don't clean it up. Now, would it matter? Would the consequences, suffering, or impact be the same whether a child who already exists cuts their foot on the glass in the next 5 hours, or if a child who doesn't currently exist but will exist in the future cuts their foot in the next 5 years? There doesn't seem to be any morally relevant difference between these two instances. In both cases, you knew that it was likely to happen. The only difference in these circumstances is the period of time that the glass was lying on the floor and that one of the children didn't exist at the time that you dropped the bottle. Neither of these variables seem in any way relevant to the morality of leaving the smashed glass there, knowing that a child would likely cut their foot on it. This lack of moral difference is what creates the double standard and the hypocrisy in accepting the imposition of harm in the procreative context, but not in other contexts. Our lifetimes contain a significant amount of suffering. I won't go fully into it here, but if you want to see a case be made for why our lives are actually much worse than we tend to give credit for, then I've made a video on this and I've linked it in the description. This suffering, the risk of extraordinary suffering, and the guarantee of death are all thus imposed on someone when you create them. On top of this, it's all done, like I said before, without even being able to consult them. We don't take such decisions with such grave consequences for someone else, for existing people, and doing so would be seen as utterly morally wrong, unless it avoided them coming to some greater suffering or harm. But that can't be said for procreation because the person we create didn't exist to be in harm's way at all. And yet this double standard, this hypocrisy, is enacted every minute of every day when we create people. Take what David Benatar says in Better Never to Have Been the Harm of Coming into Existence. Causing or risking harm is often countenanced in the reproductive context to an extent that it would not be tolerated in any other context. Consider, for example, somebody who is either a carrier of or a sufferer from a serious genetic disease, such as Tay-Sachs or Huntington's, or an infectious disease such as AIDS. Under at least some circumstances, or for Huntington's in all circumstances, this person's offspring stand a very high chance of being affected, 25 or 50% in the case of genetic disorders and somewhere in between for infectious diseases such as AIDS. Whereas many societies ordinarily would not tolerate behavior that would put others at such risk of so serious a harm, there is often considerable tolerance of reproductive conduct that poses this kind of risk and harm. And we've got to remember that the serious risks of harm that we're exposing people to by creating them aren't limited to the examples of hereditary diseases or infectious diseases that Benatar uses here. He also provides a simple way to test if this double standard is at play in our thinking. I have argued that the quality of people's lives is much worse than they think. With a more accurate picture of the quality of ordinary human life, we are in a better position to determine whether starting such a life is indecent, given that starting a new life can never benefit the person whose life is begun. Questions of decency and indecency are notoriously hard to answer, of course. However, if we employ a quite reasonable test, we find that it must indeed be indecent to start lives that are filled with as much harm as characterizes ordinary human lives. The test is this: ask whether the amount of harm in a life could decently be inflicted on an already existing being. Would the action that you're thinking of taking that would directly impact your offspring who don't exist yet be acceptable if you were to do it to an already existing person? If not, then why would it be okay to do to someone who doesn't exist yet, but will exist to suffer the consequences of your actions directly? Okay, time for some objections. Let's take them one by one. Objection 1. Creating someone provides benefits, not just harms. So this objection claims that there's no issue here, or it's being blown out of proportion because creating someone benefits them. So there's nothing really to see here. But then the question is, how can creating someone benefit them? They can't even be created for their own sake. Remember, they don't exist to want to come into existence.
It's not as a long sort of cabinet full of potential ghost fetuses going, we want to be born, right?
Any of the purported benefits of coming into existence, like access to meaning or pleasure or well-being, none of these things are wanted or needed until someone is created. So they can't be appealed to as a reason to create someone. Now, I would say that all of this suffering and risk is accepted on behalf of someone else without any compensatory benefit. But you don't have to maintain that view to see the hypocrisy here. Even if we did say that creating someone could benefit them in some way, it's extremely controversial to assert that we can impose the magnitude of harm that is being imposed because the person we're imposing it on stands to benefit in some way from that. Let's be real. People get offended if you nudge them out the way and order their coffee for them, but in that case, it's a very small inconvenience or harm, and they're guaranteed a coffee out of it. When you create someone, it's way more serious, and the benefit isn't even guaranteed, and if it does occur, it's uncertain to what degree. And even if we did know the magnitude of the benefit, we wouldn't know if that magnitude of benefit is sufficient for the person we're creating to accept in return for the magnitude of harm we're imposing on them. Who are we to say that they should accept these odds? All of these things about the benefit are unknown, and they all rest upon a very controversial foundation that we can impose significant harm on someone without being able to consult them for a speculative benefit. Objection 2. Creating someone will benefit others. Yes, creating someone can benefit others, but again, would we accept this level of harm being imposed on an existing person to bring the same sorts of benefits to other people? Don't we fight against harms being imposed on someone for the benefit of others? Don't we boycott and try to lobby companies to reform that use slave labor and sweatshops? Because we see it as morally wrong to impose such conditions and harms on someone for the benefits we receive in return. If someone wants to accept the standard that we can impose these sorts of harms on people for the benefit of others, then there's not really a knockdown argument we can say to get them away from having this belief. But they've just got to recognize that whilst they've escaped the label of hypocrite, they've just run towards other labels which seem to be much worse. Objection 3. Our responsibility for the harm suffered by future people is watered down and unclear. That's the relevant difference here. So the further someone is away from us into the future, the more variables are at play that determine the harms that they suffer. So it's reasonable to say that the actions that you take as an individual today are probably less important in determining the harms that they suffer in the future. And so your responsibility for those harms is much diminished. But this is the case for people in the distant future. They are many, many times removed from us. This isn't the case for our direct offspring that we have control over whether we create or not. If it weren't for our actions, they specifically wouldn't exist. Therefore, we bear the responsibility for them being created and the resulting harms. So this objection seems to be misplaced. Anyway, let me know if you think there is a hypocrisy and double standard in the creation of new people. Let me know what you thought of my thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.